the larger fellowship, a Unitarian Universalist congregation with no geographical boundaries. We believe in cultivating curiosity and transformation that is rooted in profound love. The COVID-19 pandemic has irrevocably shaped how connections are formed in congregations across the United States and the world. The Church of the Larger Fellowship is committed to being a resource within Unitarian Universalism and beyond. From worship to covenant groups, from classes to pastoral care, and from our monthly magazine Quest to our online community hub and our letter writing ministry, we have found ways to build connection and community even through the screen. We have been a model for ministry on the margins, providing services for isolated Unitarian Universalists, becoming a spiritual lifeline for our members in prison. The CLF supports the ministries of those who hold target identities: Blue, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism; Trust, Transgender Religious UU Professionals Together; and Drum, Diverse Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries, just to name a few. We know better than anyone how deep and meaningful connections can be formed, even from a distance. Unitarian Universalists have faced many challenges in these times, and we continue to persevere and fight for justice and equity for all people, especially during moments of crisis. We are proud to be a leader in this faith movement, and we invite you to get involved in our ministry. We strive to be a place where anyone from anywhere can find spiritual refuge anytime they need it. Welcome to the Church of the Larger Fellowship.
Welcome, beloveds. Welcome, friends. Welcome to this week's episode of The VUU, Voices of Unitarian Universalism. We are so excited that you are here and that we are here. And as always, we start our time with a check-in from our hosts. I am Christina Rivera, she, her pronouns. I am co-lead of the ministry team here at the Church of the Larger Fellowship. And I am currently in Virginia, where it is just ridiculously cold, and I object, but I guess I'm not in charge of that, so I'm just trying to deal with it. Aisha, how are you doing?
I am Aisha Hauser, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am on the land of the Coast Salish people, also known as Seattle, Washington. And it doesn't matter. The weather could be 12 inches of snow and freezing, and I would be feeling so warm. And I actually feel pretty good because finally that war criminal Henry Kissinger died. And I'm one of the people who comes from a country who was impacted by his heinous terrorism, Cambodia, Vietnam, many, many others. So he was a war criminal who died, and I'm not one of those people who are like, oh, you need to not talk ill of the dead. I will quote Ijeoma Oluo, speak the truth of the dead. So I just wanted to put that out there. Back to you, Chris. I am also part of the lead ministry team. We're going to be small and mighty today. A lot of our hosts are out for the day, and so we are very excited to be here with our special guest.
So before we get to our guest, Aisha started us out with our UU roundup, and I also reflect that yes, we can speak the truth about the dead. What better time to do that other than when we're trying to hold them accountable? And yeah, that period in time was just horrific, and what he led was horrific, and there's no reason not to say that, both when he was alive and now that he's passed. So
he also advised presidents his entire fucking life. I mean, it's not that when he ended his official tenure, his heinousness, he's worse than J. Edgar Hoover for how this country is behaving. That's saying fucking a lot, because J. Edgar was a monster himself. And for those of us who want to center liberation and truth-telling and reconciliation, we cannot overstate the damage that people who grasped onto power and held it, even if they weren't officially ever elected or ever put there by anyone other than other power-hungry, awful people. So
And I mean, he was a kingmaker, and used that power to continue his own power. So there's no reason not to name that. Other news in our UU roundup, some of y'all may have heard about the targeted attack and shooting of 3 content warning for gun violence, content warning for Islamophobia. There was, over the weekend, 3 college students who were visiting some friends and family in Vermont were targeted and shot. And thanks be to God, they're all recovering to certain different amounts and degrees. But it has come to light that the attacker, the shooter, has UU affiliation with 2 different congregations. And I say that not because we should be shocked, but because we have to own the hate that is within our own community, right? And I've heard a lot of times people say, well, there's just such a small number, and we shouldn't give them bandwidth or our time. And yes, that's true, but it's also to our peril to ignore them, because what they are able to do and what they'll resort to do to further their own agenda is dangerous, and it's harmful to people. So
I also want to clarify, the 3 young men were wearing keffiyehs and they were speaking Arabic. So they were Palestinian. So they were targeted specifically because they were Palestinian. And when I heard that the shooter had UU affiliation, my first thought was of when my mother when 9/11 happened and it came out that the 15 hijackers were Muslim, the lead one was Egyptian Muslim, and my mother said, no, it was a conspiracy, because what she didn't want to believe that the faith that she loves included people who would do that. And that's literally, and what I thought was, no, it is not the fault of Unitarian Universalism. However, nothing in our faith prevented this. Nothing in how we operate in the world. And this is, Vermont's one of the most liberal states, maybe the most liberal state, certainly the whitest. We have quite a few UU congregations in Vermont. And like, in what ways, to me, the soul searching question is, in what ways are we not, it's yes, holding people accountable, and also what kind of communities are we fostering that don't many of our communities operate our VUU brick and mortar congregations as country clubs. And I've been taken to task for years for saying that. Somebody said to me it was a microaggression. A white woman said, that's a microaggression when you call us a country club. Okay, so tell me how we're different. Oh yeah, yep, hand to God, I said this is a country club, and this white woman turned to me and she said, Aisha, that's a microaggression because we're not a country club. Well, you operate like one. Help me understand.
It's a microaggression against country clubs. Good Lord.
I guess. Stop it. So anyway, I guess that's what I've been thinking since. Like, I was disappointed because I think, and I don't have an answer. I'm saying, like, the question that I'm asking is, and I've been asking, is how do we, as UUs, as UU faith leaders, as people who want to make the world a better place, and we've now known there's a wide range of what that means or what that looks like. I recycle. I'm making the world a better place. The bar is in fucking hell, right? or I'm fighting for liberation and want to center community care. What does that look like? So nothing that, I mean, it is not the fault of those faith leaders in those congregations or obviously. However, how are those places holding people, moving through what it means to be a UU faith community in a way that would have, anyway, that's what came up for me.
I totally agree. And we need to do better. I mean, we know better. We absolutely know better. It's not a failing of knowledge or failing of, like, we've been told, we've been telling. It's, we know better. Now we need to do better. The learning part, in my opinion, yes, everybody's on their journey, all of that, but it's very clear, at least to me, that we are paying even the smallest amount of attention, that we need to do better. Other exciting things in UU Roundup, the MFC is meeting this week, Ministerial Fellowship Committee. We've had lots of great conversations on the Ministerial Fellowship Committee and the ministry ministry formation process. You can take a look at our podcast, our previous podcast, to hear our opinion of that whole thing. But blessings to everyone who is a part of that process, because it's long and arduous and faithful work. So thank you all for doing that. And if you are thinking about General Assembly, as always, the General Assembly spots for workshops, applications are open. Everything is on demand this year. All of the workshops are on demand this year. So that's a different way of being community. I've got feelings about it that we don't need to go into today, but I did want to let folks know that if that's something that you want to participate in, those applications are due right after the new year. So you gotta get going. All right, we are thrilled and excited to welcome our guest, Alex Kapitan. Yay! Alex is a lay community minister, educator, editor, consultant, and activist, a trans and queer lifelong Unitarian Universalist. Alex does interfaith LGBTQ work and supports congregations in becoming places of radical welcome for all. She is the co-founder of the Transforming Hearts Collective, the co-leader of the program Trans Inclusion in Congregations, and the founder of Radical Copy Editor. I love the Radical Copy Editor, an anti-oppressive language project. Welcome to the show, Alex. Hello. Yay!
I'm also sick. So
yes. And
my voice is a little froggy today, so apologies in advance.
Froggy. You sound great. You sound great. So we're thrilled you're here, froggy and all.
It's great to be here.
So I kind of want to take it from the bottom, because really the Radical Copy Editor is just one of my favorite things out there. Like every time I see one of your graphics come, kind of scrolling by on Facebook or, in different places, I stop to read it, because I know that there is going to be a gem in there. How did that come about? Like how did that start?
You. That's lovely to hear. For folks who aren't aware of that alter ego of mine, I am a radical copy editor, and I have a blog under that handle. And I really do see it as a form of public ministry. I have a past life as an editor, and I worked in publishing for a number of years. I actually worked for Beacon Press, our UU like adjacent press, and that was really awesome. And I've always been an editor on the side to help make ends meet my whole career. And I care a lot about words, and I care a lot about the power of words to help us make meaning and help us sort of communicate, and through communicating, we communicate our values. We communicate cultural values and norms, whether we're aware of it or not. Language holds so much power. I'm a big nerd, so I care a lot about this kind of stuff. And I really do believe that how we use words is potentially a spiritual practice. It is a spiritual practice for me. And so this ministry, this radical copy editor ministry, is really all about helping people use words for good, use words in ways that align with their values and help describe and further those values in the world through how they use language. Most of that work that I do is actually not in faith circles. Most of my radical copy editor work is actually, I mean, I have a wide readership of all sorts of people, but I do a lot of consulting. I do a lot of workshops on language, and most of those workshops are for editors, people in publishing. I do workshops for like cultural institutions and museums, for activist organizations. I'm doing one for the Nature Conservancy next week. That'll be fun. Media organizations, that kind of thing. Folks, organizations that have a mission-driven focus, a progressive orientation, and want to sort of gain more tools in how to use language with care and in ways that are responsive to things like racism, ableism, classism, gender-based violence, that kind of thing. So that's a lot of fun. And sometimes I actually did a keynote at this very small book publishers conference in the spring, and I told them that I was a preacher. And I think that they thought I was being like metaphorical because the rest of the day I kept having people coming up to me like, "Oh, I really liked your keynote." And then they'd be like, "Wait, no, you're actually a preacher?" Like they just couldn't quite align that. It's a very secular space, I think, publishing a lot of the time. And so it's really lovely to get to sort of break that stereotype a little bit and say, no, actually, this is part of how we can live our values in the world, regardless of your spiritual path or lack thereof. So that's a little bit about Radical Copy Editor. You can find it at radicalcopyeditor.com if you're interested in learning more.
Put me on. So when I'm thinking about language, I'm always thinking about English and in Spanish, and the facility with which English has, or we use the English language to be more inclusive. Not everybody's on board, 100% of that. But the challenge of Spanish, and in terms of it being a gendered language, and I'm wondering, like, are there counterparts to you doing this work in other languages? Or yes, there are. That makes me so happy.
Yeah. It's beautiful. I mean, it's really amazing getting to sort of see how people are engaging with this in all sorts of different contexts and in all sorts of different languages. I think there's a huge movement of folks within Spanish in various different parts of the Spanish-speaking world engaging with this very question, particularly around the gendered nature of Spanish, because a lot of languages have grammatical gender, which a lot of people in English-speaking places don't entirely understand, because we don't have grammatical gender in English, and it's a way of it's a grammatical structure. It's a way of sort of organizing words, and it's not really intended to align with sort of human identity, but that is often you can't really separate these things because that's just not how our brains work. So it is a challenge, and it's really beautiful to see and to hear about people who are doing similar work within those sorts of languages, where it's a lot harder to do that. A lot of the time is to sort of make space for more of us in those languages.
I know within the Spanish community, like we came up with Latinx to be, not, it used to be Latino or Latina, and if there was a group of 100 women and there was one man in there, that group becomes Latino, it becomes gendered male automatically. And so Latinx, which had the suffix of the X on there was the chosen word for a while. And I distinctly remember Marisol Caballero and myself going, why is it an X? Who chose this? Why is it an X when it first started coming up? Because it like the X letter has very limited, like it just didn't make sense. And we were both like, it should be E, like Latine, because that's a letter that would be easier to conjugate with other words. And lo and behold, like 10 years later, we're starting to see Latina as an alternative to Latinx. And I remember texting Marisol, I'm like, look, it's coming. But even then, it's not understood.
Right.
It's certainly not understood globally. But even within the U.S. In regular speech, and similarly with different pronouns that are available within the English language. How would you advise groups like struggling with that from like a copy editor standpoint?
Well, I mean, if I can go back to Latinx, because it's one of my favorite case studies in this kind of conversation. The reason I love this story is that Latinx isn't actually meant to be generic. It isn't meant to be inclusive. It's meant to be a form of resistance against gendered language. So Latinx actually comes out in my research and my understanding, and in the groups in which I run, my understanding is that it much more closely follows the lineage of Latin at sign, right? So for a while, for a couple of decades in the late 1900s.
Right. Yeah, it was
but the at sign was a form of resistance. It wasn't pronounceable. You couldn't say it out loud. It was a way of marking this as other. We're not following the rules, right? We're using an at sign that encompasses both the A and the O. And that was a form of resistance. And and as time went on, the precursor of the X, I believe, and I don't know this for sure, but I've done some research that points to, and I've heard other people talk about this, that the X was being used throughout countries in this hemisphere, in Latin America, as again, a form of resistance to words that had an O or an A ending. They would be X'd out, like literally crossed out the A or the X. Now, this wasn't being used with the word Latino, of course, because the word Latino is a word specific to the United States. It means someone who lives in the United States who has Latin American ancestry or origins, and more than that as well, but like in a nutshell. And so, of course, this word wasn't being used in Mexico because it's not a Mexican word, but other words were being used, and you saw this X happening. And so that is part of the lineage of this word, is that the impetus behind this word was to be a sort of a very radical slap of saying, full stop. We need to stop using gendered endings for our words. And so we're going to put up a stop sign that says, you need to pay attention. You can't pronounce this. You have to actually deal with that. But the problem is people didn't understand that as an intervention, right? As a radical intervention in terms of language. And people, particularly English-speaking folks in the United States, who were like trying to do the right thing or use the new best language to refer to all people within this group, were like, oh, Latinx is the new way, is the new generic word that we're supposed to use to describe all people of Latin American ancestry of origins. That wasn't what it was meant to communicate. So of course there's going to be backlash against that, right? So that's what makes it so fascinating to me, is that you've got this push-pull dynamic happening between people with a radical orientation and people with a sort of generic trying to use language in this neutral kind of way orientation. And those are both totally reasonable orientations, but they're never gonna, that's not gonna work.
Yeah.
So what do you
We're not
use,
gonna-
Alex? I'm curious what you use when referring to Latina
Yeah.
folks. Like what where have you landed or have you?
So what I advise, I've never had a conversation with UUs about this because I honestly don't do a lot of word nerd ministry with UUs. I've actually started preaching about it very recently. Because people have started inviting me to, but this work does tend to live within like the publishing world for me. So in the publishing world though, I've had a lot of people ask, Alex, what should I do? I'm publishing a book and I don't know, this topic is live. Some people hate Latinx, some people love it. I can't go back to Latino because that just feels like a step backwards. Although some people are tempted to do that, I don't think that's a good idea. And it really depends on what you're trying to communicate and who you're trying to communicate to. So I have a good friend who I talked about this with a couple of years ago, who it works on the national level in LGBTQ faith work, not within Unitarian Universalism. And I was like, how do you use these two words, Latina and Latinx, because they're sort of coexisting at this moment. And she's like, yeah, it's really interesting that you asked that because I find myself using Latinx when I'm talking to or about queer and trans people. And I use Latina when I'm talking about more generically and neutrally all folks of Latin American ancestry or descent. I'm like, that makes sense. That's how I'm seeing it continue to be used, because that is the arena in which it took off, is within queer and trans folk, to say, we aren't like everyone else. You can't actually call us Latino or Latina. We need something different, and we need you to pay attention in a different way. So that's where that tension comes up between an active intervention, an in-your-face radical sort of pay attention thing, and a generic, neutral, I just want to live my life and have language without having to make a big deal out of it, which honestly I think is a great sort of parallel to what you brought up, Christina, about pronouns, because we are gaining more and more language now, as folks like me who are non-binary are sort of like, there's all these different flavors of non-binary people. So some non-binary people like me have been identifying as genderqueer for a very long time. I use pronouns like Z and per that are very unique and uncomfortable for a lot of people. People experience those as very different. And that suits me because I have my gender is a gender of pushing back and actively being in resistance to the structures of normative gender in our world, right? There are a lot of other non-binary people who just want to live their lives without having to make gender a big thing all the time. And I was just writing about this the other day. I was reflecting on a conversation I had with a good friend of mine who's also non-binary, probably about 10 or 15 years ago now. And it was when they and them as pronouns were first starting to be used more and more by non-binary folks, because this was a moment in time in which that started to happen after both of us had come out as genderqueer. At that moment in time, in the late 90s and early 2000s, Z and HIR, spelled HIR, were the most common pronouns for people like us. They weren't very common, but they were the most common. And then they and them started to take off. And my friend was trying to sort of figure out whether they wanted to use the pronouns they, them for themselves. And so we were sort of talking about this together. And we both sort of felt as though Z as a pronoun was in your face. It was Latinx, right? They as a pronoun was like, this is just a pronoun that's already in common usage. People don't like to think of it as grammatically correct, but it has been in consistent use as a singular pronoun to refer to random unknown people, like who's on the phone, tell them I'll call them back, right? We've said this is the way in which this pronoun has been used for years and years and decades and centuries. So it feels more neutral as opposed to in your face. So they is Latin A, right? It doesn't rock the boat as much. But Z is Latinx. It's in your face. It is actively antagonistic toward the structures of gender that we have inherited, which I think says a lot about the ways in which and why we end up with lots of different words, because people have all different kinds of experiences that they're trying to communicate through words. And particularly when it comes to self-identity, that becomes very important, right? Whether we're talking about race or ethnicity or gender, if that makes sense. See, you got me on my nerd soapbox.
No, it's so important. Yeah.
Can we stay here for a second? Because so right now, banning of books is
Yes.
the red herring that the right is wanting us to look at while they're dismantling our systems and making us more fascist. So you're invited into publishing spaces, and your very presence is political. You are not, you are who you are unapologetically.
That's right.
You and I have known each other for such a long time. I was like, anyway, nostalgic. When it was 25, when it was way back at the UUA,
Yep.
just so you all are not in my head, Alex and I worked together at the UUA many, many years ago. And so it's exciting to be in this space. So I guess my question is, when you give these speeches, and I heard that it's secular space that you're in, they can't not be political. I mean, in some ways, do you feel like what do you say? What do you talk about? Because there's such a weirdness in this country about like, we're not going to get political. Everything we fucking do is political. Everything. There's no getting around it.
That's
so
right.
how do you approach this? You're being, the radical copy editor, if that's the name of your blog and website. And so they're inviting you knowing that you're going to come in a certain way. And I'm curious, what are some of the more kind of maybe radical things you talk about? And what's do you do a Q&A? What's the most interesting question you've been asked? I'm curious about that part of your work.
Yeah, I think the main reason why I feel a call to do this ministry, because it does feel like a call, is that there are so many folks out there, including so many Unitarian Universalists. I feel like this is very common amongst UU circles, who genuinely want to do the right thing. They want to say the right thing. They want to have the right words. They want to understand intellectually, right? And have the words to communicate concepts and things, right? But there's a rigidity to it in terms of, please just give me the right words to say. Please just tell me what's correct, right?
Yeah.
So that I can be a good person. I can show that I'm a good person. I can manifest my good personness. It feels like it comes from this place of almost fear of making a mistake, right? Sometimes it's a fear of hurting someone's feelings, or hurting and causing harm. That is a reasonable fear, right? Because words do cause harm, and people are starting to realize that more than I think we had a sort of way of talking about in decades past. But there is this fear, and there's this rigidity around that, in which people tend to try to just latch onto rules. And this is the right word, or this is we have to use this word now. We can't use this word anymore, that kind of stuff, right? And the sort of core of what I do is try to help people have more of a sense of playfulness, a sense of joy, a sense of expansiveness, a sense of just understanding that the English language, all languages, but particularly the English language, is a mess.
Right?
It's a cobbled together mess of all sorts of different roots and all the kinds of places that the rules of English came from. It's all just a gobbledygook mess. And it's ever evolving, it's ever changing. And there's no real rhyme or reason sometimes for why people use words the way they do, even though we try to put order onto it. We try to put reason onto it and stuff like this. But we don't have a body like French does that literally hands down, here are the rules of French. If people didn't know this is a thing. There is an actual entity in France that makes the rules. English isn't like that. So it's very overwhelming to a lot of people to try to navigate that. And so what I try to do is I try to help people understand and lean into the fact that everything is contextual, There's no such thing as right language. There's no such thing as a binary between bad words and good words. There's actually a spectrum, and all language carries all sorts of meanings and norms. So it's more of a practice of just working to be aware, figuring out, being in relationship across lines of difference so you can actually understand how different people use words differently, and honor that and get excited about that instead of getting annoyed about it, right? If we had a better way of understanding, for example, we could have a whole podcast episode just about the quote unquote Ebonics nonsense that happened.
Well, that's what I was going to say,
right?
is that I think one of the reasons why there's this desire to know the right thing to do at best, and when it's purest, you're right, is because they don't want to hurt. We don't want to hurt one another, right? That's at best. But I think that particularly in UU spaces, it's because language is weaponized,
right,
and used as class indicator, right?
That's right.
And so it is so crucial to folks who have privilege, whose language has led them to that privilege, that they do have it, quote unquote, right.
That's right.
Because that use of right language has led them to a place of privilege, and wanting to continue that in that privilege and power is crucial to maintain that power, right?
Yeah. Well, and
so I totally get them wanting to know.
Right. It makes sense. Oh no, we lost Christina for a second. But
let's bring on DC.
Hey, it's DC.
DC is here.
Oh, there they are.
There's DC.
Hey, we had an early break for lunch on the first of the MFC, and I am highly caffeinated, so I thought I'd stop by.
Well, we have just delved into the work of Alex Kapitan and the Radical Copy Editor, which hasn't even, and we haven't even started on the.
You might just stay here. I mean, this is great. This is a great conversation.
It is, for real, because it just highlights so much all of our assumptions around language. And when you were talking about the radical origins of Latinx, for a lot of us, that was coming at the same time as the drop down, Mr. or Miss, Ms. Mix, MX came, and having that on parallel trajectories, really, it said a lot about that, and not a lot about the folks that were actually trying to use this in language, like actually trying to change the flow and scope of Spanish in order to eliminate the binary gender of Spanish, and how it became just, it became so and still is just so fraught. And like, my Spanish is not fluent by any stretch of the imagination. I'm conversational, always. I have always claimed that. But even like trying to get the sentences out as I've known them, and then trying to change it into a non-binary language sentence structure is, I'm like, I don't even know how the fluent people are doing it.
Well, and I think that speaks too to like what we were just talking about in terms of people's desire to have the right word, and for there to be one right way to use words, and then argue about it.
I can't even argue. I can argue about it in English. There's no way I can argue about it in Spanish. I think somebody else has taken that.
I think BIPOC is another really good example of this, because I saw BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, person of color, first being used out of organizing around Standing Rock. So you had a situation. I don't know. I'm not like a definitive. I'm not a like lexicographer, linguist kind of person. I haven't actually like figured out if this is where it originated. But that's where I first saw it, and it made sense to me because that is a situation in which you had Black and Indigenous folks from across the Canadian border and the U.S. border, like that border is right there. So you had this situation where you were foregrounding the oppression of Indigenous folks, and also there's Black solidarity with that. And so there's this interesting way in which it became important to talk specifically about Black anti-Black racism and colonization and anti-Indigenous sentiment, right? So you've got this situation where you've got this very specific solidarity, a need to foreground those voices. And of course it made sense then that a term like BIPOC emerged. And then a whole lot of people who had no idea what this term was meant to communicate started thinking, oh, this is the new best way to talk about people of color. We're not saying people of color anymore. We're saying BIPOC. That's the right word. And people started copying that without understanding what it was meant to communicate. And then there's fallout from that because that, it did mean something very specific in a specific context, and it made sense in that context. But if you take it outside of that context, you start using it to communicate something else entirely. Now you've got folks like my Asian friends who are like, I don't know if I'm part of this acronym or not. I don't actually know whether I'm included anymore. So there's all of this fallout and all of this pushback and all of these hot takes and thought pieces instead of just being able to communicate.
Yeah, and that's how POC came about as well, right? The connotation of people of color in order to politically actively organize around oppression, based on race and ethnicity in one phrase,
right? Which is useful in certain contexts.
Exactly.
Because it means something very specific, right? And it's used in that particular way. But people all the time, we start talking about just the language of identity, and people want there to be one term for this massive group of folks that isn't monolithic in any way. Potentially, to a certain degree, they are all targeted by racism to varying degrees in varying ways. Right? Yeah. So we need to be able to talk about that. But this is what happens and that's the nature of oppression. The way that oppression works is it splits all of humanity into a binary around some axis. And then people who are granted the most sort of cultural value relative to that identity get to be rendered in detail. Lots of stories, lots of words, lots of language to describe them. We can talk about the difference between, people from Manitoba, white people from Manitoba versus white people from, BC or Newfoundland. But but then we've got everyone else is rendered in a monolithic, painted with a single brush, stereotyped in particular ways. And that's part of the nature of how language serves to uphold oppression when we do that. And we say, well, there's white people and then there's everyone else and they're all the same. We're going to talk about them using the same language profile. So I think the thing that I would like to be able to help you understand relative to all of this is, first of all, trying to find the right way to do anything, the right words, the right rules is not in line with our UU faith, because that's not how Unitarian Universalism teaches us to be. It teaches us to honor multiple truths, right? It teaches us to search for meaning and recognize that everyone's search for meaning is going to look different. They're going to use different words. They're going to follow different rules. They're going to break different rules. And so if we insist that let's just go there, the word God, the word prayer, right? The word sin, like these sorts of words, there's a lot of UUs out there that have an extremely negative association with words like these because of their life experience, because they've learned to associate these words with a particular flavor of religion that feels violent to them, perhaps, or at least just doesn't fit. But that doesn't mean that that's the only definition or experience of those words. And as Unitarian Universalists, I feel we have a responsibility to make space for different definitions and different experiences of words, much less whole spiritual beliefs and experiences. So that's ultimately, I think, where this work fits into Unitarian Universalism, is trying to help people make space for difference and the difference that our differences make.
Well, recognize that it's uncomfortable. That's why people want to do the right thing or have the answer as if it's math.
Right.
Is because there's a false sense of control. If we know how to do it, nothing can go wrong, and I can pretend I can control what's around me. And people in the United States, especially white people who have had a certain amount of privilege, are really, are terrible at nuance and are realizing just how scary and out of control the world really is. So I think everything that you're saying, Alex, is so important, and it's the faith development component of it is knowing that we sometimes aren't going to have the exact right answer, and the answer is going to change. We might have it for 5 minutes, and then let's expand our capacity for not only discomfort, but knowing that we're in control of very little. When I first came to humanist VUUs, especially the really staunch ones, I'm like, okay, fine, but we can agree we can't control the fucking weather. You can't make it rain. So really, there's very little we're in control of. Let's be clear. Anyway, I had no question there. It was just mostly about discomfort. Go ahead, DC.
So, my microphone live. Okay, good. And as so often happens, I feel like I'm doing the well-meaning but stupid white person voice here, which is I'd really like to not be able to hurt people. I actually, and I want to use the right language. And damn it, keeps it's a moving target.
Yep.
Like, what the hell? Right? That's just it's like I really want to not be an asshole.
I once did a Trans 101 workshop for a group of UUA staff a long time ago.
Oh, right, yeah.
And someone from the IT department, who I won't name because there's no need, came up to me and said, "Could you just tell me what the words are going to be tomorrow?"
Right.
And I was like, "Are you serious?" And yes, this person was serious. There was a sense of I just want to know. These words are changing, and I want to know where they're going, and so that I can, but that's not how anything works, right? We have to be in relationship.
Yeah, life is damn in
relationship with a dictionary. We have to be in relationship with each other, and it's beautiful when we are. I think there's a sense in which people want to know, what does genderqueer mean? I can tell you what genderqueer means, but that doesn't mean you're going to know who I am. And it doesn't mean that you're going to know who a different genderqueer person is, because we're different people and we have different identities. I can tell you the dictionary definition of the word woman, but that doesn't mean that you're going to know any particular person who uses that word to describe herself, right? That's just not how any of this works. But it does make sense that people have a tendency to hyper focus on words when we are trying to make sense of things that we don't have a lot of skill around. We haven't been taught. We haven't had the experience of being in deep relationship with people who are really different from us in profound ways, and we're worried about messing up. But I think one of the biggest spiritual lessons I've ever received from my spiritual mentors is that the goal is not to not make mistakes, because we're all going to make mistakes. The goal is, what do we do? How do we repair after we make a mistake? That's the spiritual piece of this, right? So yeah, I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to say something that hurts someone. That's just a given. And what do I do next is what matters most, not doing everything I can to avoid being in that situation. Because if I do that, I'm going to lose out on those relationships ultimately, because I'm just going to avoid them.
Mm.
And to make it all about me when I make the mistake, as opposed to about the other person. Like that's one of the kind of the knee-jerk reactions I see in our communities, is like just the falling over themselves to try and make it right, and sometimes you're just like, oh my God, you're making this more than I can possibly deal with in this moment. Can you take a breath?
Let go of our self-identity as good. And by good, we define good as perfect, right? That's sort of the way in which this operates. If we could just let go of that self-identity and recognize that we are human, we are messy, that's just the nature of being human, then I think that would go away. You know,
if we could be kind, I'd really appreciate that. Like, let's try that for a while. We are important. Yeah, we are coming to the end of our time. I want to make sure that if there was anything that you wanted to make sure that we knew, or any of those kind of things.
There was a little piece of a previous thread that was benigling me, because you mentioned pronouns, and I talked a little bit about them in terms of just like parallels with, you know, other self-identity terms, but it is something that I think is causing a lot of angst in our UU spaces right now, pronouns in particular. And I think they and them in particular amongst pronouns. And I think one of the reasons for that is what I see as this sort of fundamentalist approach to language rules.
Yeah.
And so, you know, one of the things that I've been preaching about recently, as I have started preaching about this topic of language a little bit more, is the fact that, you know, language rules aren't more important than people. Right. People matter more than punctuation, right? Relationships matter more than subject-verb agreement. And not everything we were taught in school is right. There's a lot of things we were taught in elementary school that were absolutely straight up lies and wrong, or maybe it's what people thought was right at the time, and now we know better, right? But like, I internalized at the tender age of whatever, 6 or 8 or something, that Columbus proved the earth was round. No part of that has any basis in reality, right? Like, that was just completely false. So why should I put any more stock into what my English teacher taught me in 3rd grade around subject-verb agreement? That's not as important as honoring the reality of and the humanity of the people that I encounter in my congregation, in my community, and, you know, giving people that respect of using the words that help them feel most alive, most present, most like they want to stay alive. Like, there's no question what's more important to me in that equation. Right. Even though, yes, it is hard, it does involve making new neural pathways, and I recognize that that's challenging, but we can do that. We absolutely can do that, especially when we support each other in doing it together. So I think that was the main thing that was still niggling at me based on our conversation.
Amen. You preached a sermon right there.
Yes. So friends, when you get the pronoun wrong, sorry, I got that wrong. I'll do better next time. Move on.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
don't make it weird.
When someone else gets a pronoun wrong, this is another thing that I think people don't understand, is that within trans community, it's a cultural norm that we just interrupt each other to correct each other, and we all move on together. So if I were to say, Christina, he said, Aisha would just say, she, I'd be like, right, she said, and we would just all move on. And I think in
Move
our
on.
wider world, that's seen as like we think that that's rude to interrupt each other or to do that kind of thing. But it's actually a wonderfully supportive practice when we all just like, oh, right, my brain messed up. I'm going to correct it and move on. So I want you all to know that if you do that, you'll be one of the cool kids because you'll be doing it like the trans people do it. And you should absolutely do that.
Amen. Well, we want to take a moment for a little bit of a goodbye. I'm not sure he's going to be able to put his face on the screen because he's actually, as we say at the CLF, behind the chalice right now. Tanner Linden has been our director of communications. And he said, no thanks. For, oh gosh, how many years is it now? 5? 6. Put it in the chat, Tanner, so I don't get it wrong. I believe it's 5. Almost 5. There we go. Almost 5 years. Tanner is moving on to bigger and better. Well, I don't know about better. Bigger adventures. Can it be better? I don't know. Anyways, he is moving on to an amazing community at Cypress Community College, is going to be doing work with making sure that funds are available for first-time college attendees, first time in their family college attendees, including Black, Brown, and Indigenous POC folks. We are so proud of the work that he has done and is going to continue to be doing. And I know he will continue to be in UU spaces because Tanner is at his heart a Unitarian Universalist, and everything that he does stems from that. We are so sad that he is going, proud that he is exploring new things, but just will be missed tremendously. So Tanner, thank you for everything. And we will see you, I'm sure, at GA and all of the other things. So
we'll have you a guest on the VUU, Tanner. We'll have you a guest as a guest finally.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So from everybody here on the VUU, all of our listeners, everybody at the CLF, thank you so much, Tanner, and we will see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to this ministry. It is because of you that this ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit clfuu.org/give for more information. We hope you will join us next week for another episode of The VUU.